All right, let's get right into it. If you're gearing up for your CMA written exams, you already know that labor laws can feel, well, incredibly dense. Reading through the statutory text is sometimes like navigating a giant maze of legal jargon, exceptions, and overlapping clauses. But mastering these concepts is absolutely crucial, not just for passing your exams, but for your future professional practice. So today we're going to clear the fog. We put together a highly efficient explainer to help you conquer some of the most heavily tested definitions and sections under the Code on Wages. Okay, let's dive in. Here's a quick roadmap of our agenda for this explainer. First, defining employee. Second, who exactly is a workman? Third, Section 3 covering anti-discrimination. And finally, Section 7 on minimum wage components. All right, Part 1, defining employee. So, Section 2K casts a massively wide net when defining an employee. We're talking skilled, semi-skilled, unskilled, manual, operational, technical, and clerical work, whether the terms of employment are express or implied. It even includes people specifically declared to be employees by the government. But here is the critical takeaway for your exam. It explicitly includes supervisory, managerial, and administrative work. If you're a high-level manager making big decisions, you are still an employee under Section 2K. Now, as always, keep an eye out for the exceptions. Members of the Armed Forces of the Union, they're excluded. Apprentices engaged under the Apprentices Act of 1961, also excluded. Moving right along to Part 2, who is a workman? Now we hit our second foundational definition, the workman under Section 2Z. I need you to pay super close attention here because this is exactly where examiners love to set traps. Reading through Section 2Z, it sounds incredibly similar to the employee definition, right? It covers persons employed in any industry for manual, unskilled, skilled, technical, operational, clerical, or supervisory work. It even specifically pulls in working journalists and sales promotion employees. And crucially, if there's an industrial dispute, it includes anyone dismissed, discharged, or retrenched as a consequence of that dispute. But to really nail this concept, we have to look at what is conspicuously missing. And this brilliantly illustrates the core difference you need to memorize. When you look at them side by side, the contrast is stark. The employee definition explicitly includes managerial and administrative work. The workman definition, it completely leaves them out. Notice also that both definitions exclude apprentices engaged under the Apprentice Act of 1961. This binary, the really broad employee versus the narrower workman, is a classic, highly predictable test point. Okay, let's talk about the rule of exclusion, because examiners are obsessed with testing exceptions over general rules. To be perfectly clear on who is not a workman, lock these 4 bullet points into your memory. Number 1, anyone subject to the Air Force, Army, or Navy Acts. Number 2, anyone employed in the police service or as a prison employee. Number 3, anyone employed mainly in a managerial or administrative capacity. And number 4, this is the trickiest one. Anyone employed in a supervisory capacity who draws wages exceeding 15,000 rupees per month. So a supervisor earning 10,000 rupees, that's a workman. A supervisor earning 20,000 rupees, not a workman, though they are still an employee. Definitely write that distinction down. Part 3, Section 3, Anti-discrimination. Let's pivot from definitions to the actual heart and social purpose of the code. The law isn't just about categorizing people, it's about protecting them. And the language in Section 3 is absolute. There shall be zero discrimination in an establishment among employees on the ground of gender when it comes to wages for the same work or work of a similar nature. Equal work demands equal pay, period. Furthermore, the code explicitly forbids employers from trying to game the system. You cannot simply reduce the wages of a higher-paid employee just to comply with this equal pay requirement. You can't lower the ceiling, you have to raise the floor. The code also outright forbids gender discrimination while recruiting for the same work, with one specific exception, unless employing women in that specific work is prohibited or restricted by another existing law. Let's translate this into a tangible scenario you might actually see in a case study question. Imagine an employer who has 2 workers, Sita and Mahesh, doing the exact same work. But since Sita is married to Ramesh, the employer decides to pay Sita half of what he pays Mahesh. Under Section 3 of the Code on Wages, this practice is strictly illegal. The employer's personal reasoning or logic simply doesn't matter. Wage discrimination based on gender for similar work is a direct violation. And just a quick note here, when we discuss scenarios like Sita and Mahesh, we aren't just making things up. This strict logic and these unwavering guidelines to end gender discrimination are pulled directly from Section 3 of your statutory text. When you write out your exam answers, you want to channel this uncompromising language. Finally, Part 4, Section 7, minimum wage components. All right, let's put our accounting hats on and see how the code actually builds the calculation of wages. Section 7 gives the appropriate government 3 legally acceptable combinations to fix or revise minimum wages. Treat this like a step-by-step formula for your notes. Option 1 is fixing a basic rate of wages, plus a cost of living allowance that gets adjusted based on cost of living indices. Option 2 is fixing a basic rate, which might or might not include that cost of living allowance, plus the cash value of concessions for essential commodities. And option 3, that's an all-inclusive rate that just bundles the basic rate, the cost of living allowance, and the cash value of concessions all into one single figure. The government can choose any of these 3 methods. If you're studying business laws and ethics, you know firsthand that labor laws can kind of feel like an endless maze of clauses and subsections, right? But today, we're going to completely demystify the Code on Wages 2019. Specifically, we're zeroing in on sections 6, 8, and 67. We'll break down exactly how the government establishes, executes, and reviews minimum wages, turning all that dense legal jargon into a clear conceptual blueprint that you can literally just plug straight into your essays.
So here's our blueprint for this session. First, an introduction to minimum wages. Second, the power to fix wages. Third, factors influencing wage rates. Fourth, the procedure for fixing wages. Fifth, inside the wage committees. And finally, number 6, rules and wage reviews. Let's hit it.
Starting off with Section 1, Introduction to Minimum Wages and its Statutory Foundation. Now, in any legal exam, knowing the overarching framework is just as crucial as memorizing the specific numbers. What you're seeing here is the actual legal text, straight from your CMA study guide. And yeah, I know, it looks super intimidating on the page, just a giant wall of text outlining the mechanics of the Code on Wages. But hey, don't sweat it. By the end of this explainer, you absolutely won't need to memorize every single comma. You're going to understand the underlying logic, which honestly makes recalling all these specifics on test day practically automatic.
All right, moving to Section 2, power to fix wages. Let's unpack Section 6.
Okay, so Section 6 is the big one. It's what actually grants the appropriate government the specific statutory power to fix minimum wage rates payable to employees. Think of this as the bedrock of the entire process. I mean, before you can have a procedure, you've got to have the power, right? If you get an exam question on how this power applies, you really need to remember this distinction. Let's say an office clerk or a retail worker. They're typically paid by the month or the hour for time work. They literally trade their time for a fixed rate. But on the flip side, a factory worker stitching garments or a packer assembling boxes, they're doing piecework, getting paid per unit of output. But here's the absolutely critical legal safety net that Section 6 provides. Even for piecework, the government must fix a minimum rate to secure those employees on a time work basis. Basically, it ensures that no matter how piece rates are calculated, the worker doesn't fall below a baseline living standard for the actual hours they put in. And speaking of that time basis, the statute is super strict about how time work is actually measured. Under Section 6, subsection 4, for time work, the government can only fix rates based on one or more of 3 specific wage periods. That's by the hour, by the day, or by the month. That's it. No other weird timeframes. It brings this much-needed standardization to the labor market, making it way easier to enforce and calculate exactly what a hardworking employee is owed. Which brings us to Section 3, factors influencing wage rates, specifically focusing on skill and arduousness. When you're tackling exam questions on Section 6, you absolutely have to remember the exact factors the government must account for. They can't just, pick a number out of thin air. The law clearly states they shall primarily take into account the skill of the workers. This means categorizing them as unskilled, semi-skilled, skilled, or highly skilled, as well as looking at the geographical area. But look at the distinction here. They may, in addition, take into account the arduousness of the work. So picture an underground coal miner. They face extreme arduousness and crazy hazardous conditions compared to, say, a surface-level packer. Even if both roles are technically at the same basic skill level, the severe temperature, the humidity, or the whole underground nature of the work legally justifies a higher minimum wage rate. And one quick side note to remember for your exam. Section 6 also explicitly states that the number of these minimum wage rates should be kept to a minimum as far as possible by the appropriate government. Okay, let's pivot to Section 4, Procedure for Fixing Wages. This is Section 8 and the 2 legal paths. So moving from the power to the actual procedure, we hit Section 8. Think of it this way. Section 6 gave the government the authority. Section 8 provides the exact step-by-step instruction manual. I want you to lock this number into your memory right now. 2. There are exactly 2 methods the appropriate government can use to fix minimum wages for the first time or to revise existing ones. If you're writing a descriptive answer, you've got to clearly distinguish between these two paths.
Let's contrast them. Method A is what we call the committee route. Here, the government appoints as many committees as it considers necessary to hold inquiries and make recommendations. It's a very consultative, investigative, hands-on kind of process. Method B, on the other hand, is the notification route. This is where the government directly publishes its proposals via notification for the information of anyone likely to be affected. Now, under Method B, they have to specify a date, not less than 2 months from the date of the notification, for the public to take those proposals into consideration. Oh, and remember this absolutely vital detail for revisions: if the government uses Method B to revise existing wages, they are also legally required to consult the Concerned Advisory Board constituted under Section 42. Huge point to include in your essays.
All right, next up is Section 5, Inside the Wage Committees, where we look at balancing the board. Let's bounce back to Method A for a second and see how this builds into a highly regulated committee structure under Section 8, Subsection 2. When the government decides to appoint these committees to hold inquiries, they can't just pack them with whoever they want. Nope, the law mandates perfect balance to ensure fairness. The committee has to consist of persons representing employers and persons representing employees. And the golden rule here? The representatives for the employees must be absolutely equal in number to the representatives for the employers. It literally guarantees that neither management nor labor can outvote the other purely based on headcount. And here is a massive exam-focused call-out that examiners just love to test. You also have independent persons on these committees to act as neutral voices, but their influence is strictly capped. Independent persons cannot exceed 1/3 of the total members of the committee. Seriously, lock that in. So if a committee has, say, 15 people total, no more than 5 can be independent persons. That leaves the remaining 10 spots perfectly split between 5 employer and 5 employee representatives. Memorize that 1/3 ratio. It's a guaranteed point score. Let's bring it home with Section 6, Rules and Wage Reviews, covering the timelines, and Section 67. For our final stretch, we really need to trace the timeline of how these notifications actually come into force. This is where Section 8, Subsection 3 comes into play. First, the government publishes the proposal. Then, like we just talked about, the public gets a mandatory minimum of 2 months to consider it and submit representations. After considering all those representations, or the committee's recommendations if they went with Method A, the government issues the final notification. But wait, hold up. It doesn't take effect immediately. Unless the notification specifically says otherwise, the new minimum wage rates shall come into force only on the expiry of 3 months from the date of its issue. So 2 months for public review, 3 months for implementation. Keep those timelines totally straight in your head.
Now, once those wages are finally set and legally in force, the government can't just walk away and forget about them, right? I mean, inflation happens, the cost of living goes up. So Section 8, Subsection 4, explicitly demands that the appropriate government review or revise these minimum rates ordinarily at an interval not exceeding 5 years. This 5-year maximum review cycle is crucial because it guarantees that worker compensation doesn't just permanently stagnate while the rest of the economy grows.
And binding all of this intricate procedural stuff together is Section 67. Think of it like this. While Sections 6 and 8 give us the broad strokes, the power, and the procedure, Section 67 explicitly grants the appropriate governments the overarching power to draft the specific, granular rules governing these exact procedures. It's basically the engine that allows the whole statutory framework to actually function on a day-to-day basis. When you sit down for your exam, I really want you to visualize this exact flow. Picture the bullet points moving from the initial proposal straight through to the final notification, and firmly remember that explicit legal requirement to review the rates every 5 years. It's really all about seeing how the statutory language you need to replicate naturally and logically connects from one step to the very next. If you've been staring at the legal text and just kind of wondering how to unpack the procedures for fixing minimum wages, or how these rules actually apply to daily on-the-ground scenarios, well, you are absolutely in the right place. We're going to meticulously break down Sections 8 through 12, and the goal here isn't just to memorize the rules, it's to deeply understand how to apply them to the exact types of practical scenarios you're going to face on your written exams. Let's get into it. So, here's our game plan. We'll start big picture with the macro rules, fixing minimum wages and the central floor wage. Then we'll zoom in on the micro rules, short working days, mixed work classes, and we'll wrap up with the piecework rules. Starting with Part 1, the macro rules. This is Section 8 of the Code on Wages.
Section 8 is totally foundational because it dictates exactly how the appropriate government sets minimum wage rates for the very first time or how they revise existing ones. They can't just pick a number out of thin air, right? The law forces them down one of two distinct procedural paths. Route A is the committee route. They appoint as many committees as they think they need to hold inquiries and make recommendations. Or there's Route B, the notification route. Here they publish their proposals publicly. Now, if they go with Route B, they are legally required to give the public at least 2 whole months to consider the proposal and respond. And here's a crucial detail for your exams. If they use this notification method to revise wages, they also have to consult the Concerned Advisory Board. Once everything is finalized, that new wage notification kicks into force 3 months from the date it's issued, unless they specifically state otherwise.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the strict math involved if the government decides to go with Route A, the committee route. This is a classic exam testing point, so pay attention. The committee has to have people representing employers and people representing employees. And the law strictly mandates a 1-to-1 ratio there. The number of employee representatives must be exactly equal to the number of employer reps. Then you bring in independent persons, but their influence is capped. The independent persons absolutely cannot exceed 1/3 of the total members of the committee. And speaking of numbers, if there is one single digit you need to lock into your memory for Section 8, it is the number 5. The code mandates that the appropriate government has to review or revise minimum rates of wages ordinarily at an interval not exceeding 5 years. Keep that 5-year cap flagged in your mind for any multiple choice or short answer questions you might come across. Okay, let's shift gears to Part 2, the central floor wage, which is Section 9 of the code. While Section 8 is mostly about the appropriate government, often a state, Section 9 brings in the central government. Think of the floor wage as the absolute national safety net. The central government fixes this baseline by taking into account the minimum living standards of a worker. They might also get advice from the Central Advisory Board and consult with state governments before making a decision. But as we all know, India's vast. The cost of living in a bustling metro is just way different from a rural district. Because of that, the code explicitly allows the central government to fix different floor wages for different geographical areas. Now, here is a golden rule for your written exam when comparing these powers. Once the central government sets that floor wage, the minimum rates fixed by the appropriate government under Section 6 literally cannot be less than that floor wage, period. But what if a state's current minimum wage is actually already higher than the newly announced central floor wage? Well, in that case, the state government is strictly prohibited from dropping their wages to match the lower floor. The floor wage is a baseline meant to push wages up. It can absolutely never be used as an excuse to pull existing higher wages down. Moving right along to Part 3, the rule for short working days. This brings us to Section 10. Let's move from the macro government stuff down to the micro, day-to-day operations. Here's a highly practical scenario. Imagine a factory worker whose minimum wage is fixed by the day. They show up for their normal 8-hour shift, but for whatever reason, they only end up working for 4 hours. So the question is, does the employer still legally have to pay them for the entire full normal working day? Well, the baseline rule says yes, they are entitled to receive wages as if they had worked the full day. But there is a massive exception that you absolutely need to know. It all boils down to the why. Why was it a short day? The exception says the worker is not entitled to the full day's wage if their failure to work was caused by their own unwillingness and not by the omission of the employer. Let's put that into an exam scenario. Say a critical machine breaks down or there's a huge power outage. That is the employer's omission to provide work. In that case, the worker gets the full day's wage. But if the worker just decides, I have a headache, I'm going to go home early, that is their own unwillingness to work. In that specific case, they do not get the full normal working day's pay. All right, Part 4, rules for mixed work classes under Section 11. What happens if an employee acts as a jack of all trades during a single shift? Imagine someone does 4 hours of semi-skilled work, and then they're asked to step up and do 4 hours of highly skilled work right after. Under Section 11, how do you pay them? The employer can't just pay the lower semi-skilled rate for the whole day to save money, right? But they also aren't legally forced to pay the higher skilled rate for the entire day either. The rule is strictly proportional. The employer must pay wages at not less than the minimum rate in force for the exact time respectively occupied in each class of work. So, 4 hours at the semi-skilled minimum and 4 hours at the skilled minimum. For you CMA students, remember, this means employers have a serious compliance burden to meticulously track time spent on varying tasks. Finally, let's bring it home with Part 5, piecework under Section 12. This section deals with employees who are paid by the piece, meaning they are paid based on results or units manufactured
rather than just clocking hours. The big takeaway here is a very specific safety net. What happens if a person is employed on piecework, but the government has only established a minimum time rate for that category of work, and they haven't actually fixed a minimum piece rate yet? Well, the statutory safety net kicks in. The employer legally must pay that person wages at not less than the minimum time rate. It basically guarantees that even if a worker is having a slow day producing widgets, they're still financially protected by that baseline hourly or daily time rate set by the government. To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a classic CMA exam application question to chew on. We just established from Section 9 that a state's minimum wage cannot be lower than the central floor wage. Okay, so what if the central government suddenly raises the floor wage so high that it actually surpasses your specific state's minimum wage? What is the state's mandatory next move? Well, considering everything we just covered, the state government would have to immediately initiate the procedures under Section 8. They'd have to either form those committees or publish notifications to revise their minimum rates upward to get back into legal compliance. Seeing how these different sections interact with each other, that is exactly what your examiners want to see from you. Keep studying hard, you've got this, and I will see you in the next explainer.